to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces and a lot of new names without faces. So great to be with you guys tonight. And yeah, many of you have had the misfortune of having me in class, but for those who have not, my name's Jay. I always ask people call me Jay, not Dr. Sklar. Jay's totally fine. Originally from the Promised Land, otherwise known as Canada. That usually gets identified if I say anything with an OU in the word, out and about. Came down to the States to study at seminary. I met my wife there, affectionately known as Ski. We just celebrated our 24-year wedding anniversary on Monday, which has been 24 years of blessing for me and sanctification for Ski. So delighted about that. My Canadian bones are loving this weather right now. Reminds me of a good early July day. So I love anything connected, of course, to the Old Testament. I've been teaching at the seminary since 2001. I love all things French. If you're a French speaker and want to practice at some point, I know I could use the practice, so don't hesitate to reach out. And I think that's about it.
That's great. Well, we were, Jay, our church was blessed by the presence of Lucas Cobb for the year that he was here in the States. And I know that you're old friends with his family from over in France. So
yeah, absolutely.
We miss having him among us. But well, we did a little bit of a survey of our people and asked people what comes to mind when you think about the book of Leviticus. And a few of the responses that we got, I'll just read off a few of them here. Laws that seem so foreign, lots and lots of laws, obscure Jewish laws, holiness, laws, and priests, God's love, cleanliness, and confusing. And my sense is, these were obviously just words on a Google form, but when people talked about laws, my guess is that there was a tone of either boredom or overwhelm in their use of that word, not necessarily laws. But that's kind of the sense that people come in with. I did want to, before you start, Jay, wanted to just show you all the outline of the book of Leviticus. We are not there yet in our reading plan, but wanted to make sure that you all had kind of a picture of it in your heads. And feel free to, if you have a Bible nearby, just open it up so you have Leviticus in front of you as we're talking tonight. But just wanted to share this briefly so you can get a snapshot in your mind. And Jay, I'll let you ask you to start by talking a little bit about why it is that you think so many people struggle with the book of Leviticus.
Well, what I want to know is who gave the answer of God's love as they went through. I'm like, great answer. I don't know who, I did not pay anyone to say that, but great answer. And hopefully, if you're not convinced of that yet, by the end of our time, you'll see, actually, that was a really good answer. But I'm not surprised that laws was such a theme. That actually means you've read the book well, if that was one of your answers. But before I identify why I think we struggle with the book, let me ask, if you do struggle with Leviticus, or if at some point in your life you have struggled with Leviticus, and for most people, they're like, if they've read it, they've struggled with it. Why is that? What do you find most challenging about the book of Leviticus? I'm really asking. You can either unmute and give an answer or throw something in the chat.
Seems like the laws are so tedious,
Okay.
just so exacting.
Yeah. All right. Good. Why else?
Yeah, something for me that always is a hurdle is it's not very exciting. there's no narratives going on. It doesn't seem like there's any, it sometimes doesn't seem like there's any great theological truths to uncover. It's just seems like a bunch of unrelated laws stacked on top of each other.
Okay. No Leviticus cliffhangers as you're reading through.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Why else?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it makes the God of the Old Testament seem much different than the God of the New Testament in some ways, just like what he required, and just a very you just get a different picture of God from reading Leviticus.
And you mentioned, especially Josh, he seems to have different kinds of requirements. Okay, what else? I'll take one or two more.
Just to piggyback off of what Jonathan said, just the Exodus being the preceding book, it's kind of a letdown because Exodus is kind of like you can turn it into a good movie, lots of action and lots of cool stuff happening, but Leviticus is like, I want to go watch another movie or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a reason why we have Charlton Heston featuring in the Ten Commandments, and we have the Prince of Egypt, but we don't have something coming out of Disney or Hollywood on Leviticus, right? Anyone else?
Jay, there's a lot of culture and ceremony that we don't understand, that we don't connect to, so we don't really know what's going on, even with the laws. Even when we do understand sort of the storyline, we don't understand what the author's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Good, and it looked like Sai or Sarah had unmuted there.
Actually, John said almost better what I was gonna say. So that's perfect.
Okay, that's great.
I guess I would just add, I sometimes struggle too because I'm like, I don't really get this. So what? I know, when you read some of the other stories, the narrative, or even in the New Testament, the letters and to the churches, it feels like, okay, I get what I'm supposed to do.
Yes.
But I don't really know when I read Leviticus.
Right. Yeah, you've never lost sleep wondering, now when I make a grain offering, do I put the oil on first or second? And, so there's lots that doesn't seem to relate. Let me try and tie some of these together into a few different headings of why I think we do struggle with Leviticus. One of the first things, and this was picked up especially in the answers that Jenilyn was reading earlier, is this whole aspect of law. It's primarily all law. And we don't often go home at night thinking, okay, I'm just going to snuggle up tonight to 27 chapters of law. And even when it's not law, so in fairness, there are at least two clear narratives in the book of Leviticus. In one of them, you have Nadab and Abihu who get killed for their rebellion against the Lord. And in the other, you have a blasphemer who is stoned to death because of his rebellion against the Lord. So even amidst the law, when you get the narratives, they're not the kind of narratives that might be first on your list to read. A second thing, that just the cultural strangeness. I think Jonathan was mentioning this. Things like purity and impurity. Most of us have just never grown up in a context where we've even thought about ritual purity or impurity. Or think of sacrifices. Actually think of sacrifices in a worship service. I don't know about at Restoration, but at my church, during a wedding, we can't even throw rice. In Leviticus, you've got blood going everywhere. It's just so foreign to us. A third thing, no one mentioned this per se, or actually it might have been picked up. Somebody talked about the tedious and exacting. There's this emphasis on ritual with all of these different intricacies of what to do and when to do it. And I think many, especially if they've grown up in a Protestant tradition, can tend to look a bit suspiciously at ritual in a worship service. I'll mention one that I don't think was mentioned. Some of the laws just seem unfair or unjust. A woman who has a girl baby is ritually impure twice as long than if she has a male baby. And then it's hard for us also to fit it into the story. Why is it occurring at this point in the narrative? So there are all sorts of reasons why we struggle with it. And as we go through some of the different questions tonight, I hope to try and make clear why some of these things, when they're put in perspective, actually can help us to appreciate Leviticus rather than struggle with it. Or maybe at the least struggle with it less. So let me stop there in terms of why people struggle with it. I wonder if I could segue to a different question and ask, why is Leviticus still important? Why is it still important? And here I want to give you 3 different suggestions for why I think Leviticus is important. The first one is simply the New Testament writers thought it was important. So if you're a follower of Jesus, you're thinking, well, if the New Testament thinks Leviticus is important, maybe I should too in some way. So let me illustrate that this way. How many books are there in the Old Testament? Bit of a Bible quiz here. How many books in the Old Testament?
Zach?
39.
39 is the correct answer. There's a man who did his ordination already. So if you were to line up, most every Old Testament book is quoted in the New Testament. And if you were to line it up from most quoted all the way to least quoted, the question is, where does Leviticus show up in the list? Now, if you and I were writing the New Testament, it might show up around 37, 38, 39. It would be doing battle with Chronicles or with Numbers, something like that, right? Actually, in the New Testament, it shows up in position number 6. 6th most quoted book of the Old Testament. The New Testament writers thought Leviticus was important. So that's the first reason why I think Leviticus still matters. Here's the second reason. Leviticus actually teaches, if you're reading the Old Testament story, it teaches God's people how to live in relationship with him. And this is where remembering the larger story is so important. Someone already mentioned Exodus and how you get to Leviticus and it's a bit of a letdown. But what happens in Exodus? Do you remember? God redeems Israel from slavery. He brings them to Mount Sinai. He puts on this pyrotechnic display where he comes down in his power and his glory, and the people just see the amazing strength and power and glory of the Lord. He has them build a tabernacle so that he can dwell in their midst. And he says, Israel, you're to be my holy people, and I'm going to dwell in your midst. And when the book of Exodus ends, the Lord descends in a pillar of cloud from heaven and fills the tabernacle. Now, I want you to imagine you're an Israelite. What kind of questions do you have at this exact moment? Well, at this moment, you're thinking to yourself, how in the world can we as a sinful and impure people have this powerful, holy God in our midst without his holiness liquefying us in our sin and impurity? Answer? Well, Leviticus, which starts with laws on sacrifice so that you know how to atone for your sin before this holy God and worship him correctly. Leviticus, which then turns in chapters 8 through 10 to talk about priests who can intercede for you on your behalf and teach you who this God is. Leviticus, who then in chapters 11 through 15 gives these laws on ritual purity and impurity so that you can deal properly with your impurity and be the pure people of God. Leviticus, which then has Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, so that you can have this spiritual spring cleaning once in a year. I mean, we look at Leviticus as a burden. If you're an Israelite at this point in history, it is a blessing because it answers questions that are burning questions for you. So that's the second reason why it's important. Here's the third reason. And this one's pretty personal for me because of how much I've experienced it in my life. Understanding Leviticus well helps you all the more to understand the gospel of Jesus. Because if you think what's central to the gospel of Jesus, it's things like sin, sacrifice, and atonement. And those are the very things that Leviticus focuses on. So let me get at it with a story. Years ago, some missionaries went to a tribe in Papua New Guinea. They went to live among these tribespeople. These tribespeople had no knowledge of anything about the Bible whatsoever. Absolutely none. And so the missionaries, after living with them for 9 or 10 months, learning the language, all that kind of thing, they got to a point where they could begin to teach these tribespeople about the Bible. But they couldn't begin in the New Testament with the stories of Jesus. They knew the New Testament didn't make much sense without the Old Testament. So they started back the very beginning in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, teaching these tribespeople about the Old Testament stories. And whenever they got to a story about sacrifice, they explained how you could have a blameless, a spotless lamb that could be offered to atone for sin, to make a way that your sin could be forgiven so that you could be right with God. Well, finally, they get to the New Testament and they get to the stories of Jesus. And for a week, Jesus is the village hero. I mean, these tribespeople are getting up before dawn to come, and they just couldn't wait to hear the stories about Jesus. Towards the end of the week, the missionaries began to tell the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. And what they did is they actually called in members of another tribe that had converted to Christianity to act out the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. And they videotaped this. And as they began to act out Jesus being arrested and beaten, you could see that the tribespeople could not understand why in the world anyone would do this to Jesus. Jesus had become their hero. Why in the world would you want to treat Jesus this way? And when they came to the point of the crucifixion, the person who was playing Jesus was wearing a shirt, and under the shirt they'd put a bag of red dye. And when the soldier came along, if you know the story of the crucifixion, a soldier comes along and pierces Jesus' side with a spear. Well, when the person playing the soldier did that, the bag of red dye broke and the shirt began to soak red as though with blood. And at that moment, you could see the dawn of comprehension come on the faces of some of the tribespeople. And when the Christ figure went into the tomb and then came back out alive, resurrected, the missionary explained, Jesus is the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. All of a sudden, all over the tribe, people started jumping to their feet. One man jumps up over here and he goes, "Ital," which in their language is yes, or I believe. I believe that Jesus is the Lamb of God and that because of him, I can be right with God and my sins can be forgiven. And a woman over here jumps up and says the same, and again and again and again. And finally, there were so many people standing in this tribe, the way that they showed excitement was to jump up and down on the spot. And all of a sudden, everyone, the whole tribe turned into a mosh pit of praise with all these tribespeople jumping up and down, praising God because of what Jesus had done, and they understood what Jesus had done because they understood the kinds of things that are taught in Leviticus. And so for me, understanding Leviticus is incredibly important, not least of which because of how it helps you understand what Jesus has done all the better.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jay. Yeah, you've told that, I've heard that story before, and it still is striking to me, just the depth of that. So as we think about, so we know that Leviticus is important, and I think that especially thinking about how it pertains to what we read in the New Testament and what we see in Jesus. So thinking about some of the nuts and bolts of Leviticus and how we can read it in a way that we can actually, get what it's offering to us. So a few questions in that regard. Why is Leviticus so concerned with purity and impurity?
Yeah, this is a great question, especially in Western context, because we don't have ritual purity and impurity. We don't think of that. So let me begin by asking, well, what is it? And here it's important to say that when we talk about a ritual state of purity or a ritual state of impurity, we're not talking about a moral state. You know, it's kind of like your health. You've got a state of health, but if you've got a cold, that doesn't mean you're sinful. It just means you've got a cold. If you're ritually impure, it doesn't mean you're sinful. It just means you're impure. What a ritual state does, let me try and explain it this way. In ancient Israel, your ritual state tells you where you can and cannot go, what you can and cannot do, especially in terms of the sanctuary, their equivalent of a church, right in their midst. It's, like I said, kind of like your state of health, which is not a moral state, but it guides you in terms of where you can and cannot go in a hospital. So if you're healthy, you can go to a hospital if your friends just had a baby and hold that baby. If you've got a bad cold, you can't go to that hospital, right? Your state of health determines where you can and cannot go in the hospital. At least to hold the baby, you can't. You might go there for other reasons, but ritual states kind of work in that way. And the important thing to know is that these weren't new to Israel. Like when Moses came down the mountain and talked about ritual states, it wasn't like the Israelites were going, I've never heard of this before. And that's because in the ancient Near East, this was a regular part of culture. Other ancient Near Eastern cultures back in Bible times had this aspect of ritual states, ritual purity and impurity. And so what happens is the Lord decides, hey, in my laws, I'm going to make use of that cultural reality. Why? I think the answer is simply this. The Lord uses this reality like a reminder thread through all of life. Because when you look at the kinds of things that were impacted by ritual purity and impurity, it was things like your food. I mean, you couldn't have a meal without thinking about ritual purity and impurity. It impacted, if you were married, your sexual relations. It had an impact on, could have an impact on things like a pile of seed in your house, if an animal fell on it, that kind of thing. So all throughout your day, you're constantly being confronted with thinking about ritual purity and impurity. And I think the reason is because the Lord wanted Israel to realize, hey, if I want you to be thinking all day long about avoiding ritual impurity, seeking to be ritually pure, dealing properly with your ritual impurity, if I'm wanting all of that at a ritual level, how much more do I want that for you at a moral level? So for example, a few years ago, I had a class, and some of the students on this call, did anyone on this call do the Living Levitically assignment? So in my, no, cowards, in my Pentateuch class, I give students an option. Hey, Joseph T. from Singapore, great to see you there, buddy. I give students an option that they can live Levitically for a week. And the instructions are follow as many laws of Leviticus as you can without being arrested. And so the students who decide to do this, one thing they need to do is write a journal of their experience every day. And then at the end of this time, I read through the journals. So once I required the whole class to do it, and I'm reading through the journals, and you see comments like, man, what was the one? I can't wear clothing mixed of two fibers. This has just wiped out 95% of my wardrobe. Or another student whose entry for the day was, I really miss bacon. But what I saw more common than any other entry was around day 3 or 4, students would record something like this. I have been spending all day and all night these past few days thinking about ritual purity and thinking about ritual impurity. And all of a sudden it struck me. If I'm to be thinking about these things at a ritual level, how much more should I be thinking about them at a moral level? Wow, the God I serve is really holy. And so I think that's probably why the Lord, who's of course the master communicator, is using something that's very familiar to an Israelite, weaving it into his laws so that they have this constant reminder, like a constant string around their finger. Israel, I want you to be a holy people.
That's, yeah, that assignment would be very impactful. If anyone wants to just do that for the fun of it, do it and report back to us, please, especially as we're reading through Leviticus over the next several weeks.
Sometimes, Jenilyn, it's good for leaders to do that as well, and then to be able to share with those that they're leading what kinds of things they've learned.
I see what you're doing there, Jay. Well, we'll discuss that at staff meeting tomorrow, guys.
Yeah.
About seniority.
Should you say something about seniority?
Yeah, Zach and I are new, so you and Dan can lead the way.
That's touche.
I've never done it.
For real?
For real, yeah. I know. I'm just chosen to embrace the hypocrisy.
That's, as long as you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So how do we, Jay, thinking about that, we frequently wear clothing made of two different types of fibers.
Yeah.
And I have not at any point felt the need to confess that as a sin against the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly somewhere along the way, we have made decisions about things that still apply in Leviticus and things that no longer do.
Right.
How do we go about determining that? How do I, as I'm reading through Leviticus, think about what still applies today and what doesn't?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I remember being in church when I did my PhD in England, and I was in church one day, and I would often bring my Hebrew Bible with me. And we had some friends there, and a brother of our friend was visiting, and he picked up my Hebrew Bible, and the names of the biblical books are written actually in English script in the very top. And he's just flipping through randomly, and he gets to Leviticus, and he goes, Leviticus. And I knew immediately why he said it that way. And he looked at me and he said, "May I ask you a question? Do you eat shellfish?" Now, in my case, I could say, no, that's disgusting. Who in the world would want to eat shellfish? But you see the point he was driving at. This is a man who is actually would identify as gay, and he's wondering, well, why is it that you Christians think that laws about homosexual practice from Leviticus still apply, and yet you eat shellfish? So it's a really important question to think through. And I think one of the first things I want to say is that often in the history of the church, Christians have actually been really hypocritical here. Or at the least, they haven't been very thoughtful. Because sometimes we have just picked and chosen laws according to what we think aligns with what's right and what's wrong. And if that's our approach to Leviticus and the laws in Leviticus, I think actually we should be critiqued. That's a very unhelpful, unthoughtful, and simply wrong approach to the laws of Leviticus. At the same time, I'd want to say lots of Christians have thought really carefully about this question of which laws from the Old Testament relate. There's been tons written on this, and the way that I think about it, or the way that makes most sense to my mind, is to think about it in kind of these steps. The first thing to say is Leviticus is part of a covenant document that God is entering into with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. So Leviticus is part of that covenant. That's what we might call the Old Covenant. When Jesus comes, Jesus establishes a new covenant. And so that means that Christians today are not necessarily under the laws of the Old Covenant anymore. Now, that word necessarily is really important. We're not necessarily under the laws of the Old Covenant anymore. And it's important for two reasons. The first is that there are a lot of laws from Leviticus that end up getting repeated in the New Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself. Did you know that law comes from Leviticus? Leviticus 19:18. I once heard somebody say, we're not Leviticus people, we're love your neighbor as yourself people. And I thought, well, spoiler alert, but that's repeated 6 different times in the New Testament. And lots of laws that you find in Leviticus show up in the New Testament as well. So that's the first reason why we want to say you're not necessarily under Old Testament law. The second reason that you'd want to say that is because behind every law, there stands a value. Laws represent the values of the lawgiver. And I think that makes sense to most of us, right? So why do we have laws against murder to this day? What is it we value? We value life, right? Why do we have laws against stealing? Well, as a society, we value the right to private property. Why do we have laws against speeding? Well, again, because so there are values behind these laws. And that means as you're reading Leviticus, you want to always be asking what kind of values might underlie this law. So let me read a law for you, and I'm going to ask you to identify some of the values that are behind it. This is from Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19 is kind of like the Sermon on the Mount of the book of Leviticus. It's just full of all these wonderful laws, like love your neighbor as yourself, that kind of thing. So Leviticus 19, here's the law. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very corners of your field, and do not gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not glean your vineyard. To glean is to pick up the extra bits left over. So don't glean your harvest, don't glean your vineyard, don't gather the fallen fruit. You will leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So if you're an Israelite farmer, you're harvesting a field, there's a strip of the field that you have to leave unharvested. And once you've done the harvest, you're not supposed to go back and pick up the little bits that have fallen off. Leave them for the poor and the needy. Now there are some values behind that law. How would you name some of the values behind that law? This is group participation time. How would you name some of the values behind that law? Give me one that seems to be there.
Value for the poor and stranger.
Yeah, value for the poor and the stranger. Good. I saw Chris put into the chat charity. Good. What else? In fact, you could say care for the poor and the stranger is more important than what? Because if you're not harvesting the whole way, yeah, Natalie?
Profits.
Yeah, then maximal profits, right? So that's a value. By the way, do you notice it doesn't say, take that strip, harvest it, and then give it out to the poor and the needy? What does it have instead? They're to go in and do their own harvesting. Why might that be? Is there a possible value that points to?
Does it give them dignity in gathering their own food?
Yeah, absolutely, Jenny. It points to the value that to give dignity to folks, to let them put in good day's work and to feel like they're making so there are all these values behind the law. And so even if you're living in a context today, you're thinking, okay, that's not repeated in the New Testament, so we don't necessarily, if we're a farmer, have to leave a strip undone. If you are a farmer, you want to be thinking about, well, what kind of farming practices can I do so that I'm still trying to be aware of those who have need and trying to, are you going to take a portion of what you make and donate it to a food bank? Are you going to, you want to begin to think through how to live out some of those values. So that's kind of how I begin to approach the question of what laws apply and they don't apply anymore. In the case, since I mentioned it, of my friend at church who asked about, laws relating to sexuality, well, what you find is most of the laws related to some of those key aspects of how we live out our sexuality are again repeated in the New Testament. So there are different ways to think about this question, but if we can think of especially values behind the law, I think it can, to an earlier point, if you're thinking of the so what, this is where some of the so what can really begin to come through.
Yeah, that's a really helpful distinction in just looking at the value behind the law. You alluded to this earlier, Jay, but you know, some of the stuff that we read in Leviticus seems to us unjust or unfair.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that, you know, the ones that come to my mind first off are the ones you mentioned it, you know, a woman is unclean for twice as long if she has a baby girl as if she has a baby boy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the things related to a woman who's on her period is impure for 7 days. And, you know, just the, that those to us with our modern eyes seem unfair.
Yeah.
How do we think about those kinds of laws as we encounter them in Leviticus?
Yeah. Well, I would say there are two important starting points. The first is be aware of your modern presuppositions. It's really important to remember that we also are coming from a context when we read things. And we're bringing modern presuppositions to the text often that weren't there for the original audience. And I'll give an illustration of that in a moment. But that's the first, be aware of your modern presuppositions. The second, let me get at this way. Has anyone ever twisted your words before? Have you ever found yourself saying, that's not what I meant? Or you're taking me out of context? Yeah, and usually when you're saying that, you're not saying, oh, hey, you twisted my words. No, it's like you twisted that's not what I meant in context. I mean, we value that people try to understand what it was that we were trying to say. And I would just say it's really important to apply that value to reading ancient literature as well, which means be aware that there is a context that they're speaking out of, and that context is one which most of us are completely unfamiliar. Leviticus is spoken to a people that is tribal. I'm guessing very few people on this call have grown up in a tribal context. Leviticus is spoken into a culture that is pre-modern. I'm guessing most of us have not grown up in a pre-modern context. Leviticus is spoken into a context that is an honor and shame-based society. Now, that's where some of us, if we've grown up in the West, we probably don't identify with that. If we've grown up in the East or have family members who have, maybe we have a bit more of a window there into that kind of society. But the point is simply this. When you come across a law that's strange or confusing, be aware of your modern presuppositions and give context the benefit of the doubt. So here's how that might work. Let me use the example of found in Leviticus 12. So just in case you haven't read Leviticus 12 recently, here's what happens there. It describes what to do when a woman's had a baby. Now, in ancient Israel, bodily fluids were often ritually defiling. So where do you find ritual defilement? You find it when people have had sex because of the ejaculation. You find it when a woman's menstruating because of the blood. You find it in childbirth because there's lots of blood and stuff. And so Leviticus chapter 12 is saying, well, how do you get pure, ritually pure after childbirth? And it says, well, if you have a boy baby, then you're impure for 14 days, and then the boy is circumcised, and then you're impure another, I think it's another 7 days maybe, and then the mother's pure. But if it's a girl baby, then you're impure at first 28 days. I mean, all the times are doubled. And so you and I are reading that. Now, here's what happens. first, we put on our modern presuppositions. And what do we conclude this must be a sign of? Sexism. But clearly, this is, and you can find commentators who will argue this. This is clearly a sign of sexism. The girls impure twice as long because they weren't valued as much, yada, yada, yada. Well, what's interesting is, I would just say, hold on. Here are a few things to begin to kind of push back against that. The first is that you have to remember this story, Leviticus chapter 12, is found in Israel's Bible. And their Bible begins in Genesis 1 by saying, male and female are equally in the image of God. Equally. I mean, that's exactly what you would expect to hear if God valued women as highly as men. That's not what you'd expect to hear if women were second-class citizens. But that's what you hear. And so anytime you come to a law like Leviticus 12, it has to make sense with Genesis chapter 1, because it's Israel's story, and that's the beginning part of their story. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The second thing, when you read through commentators who are coming from periods of time that are much more patriarchal than 21st century America, it's amazing how often they're giving explanations that are not related to sexism. You might expect, if a commentator is writing on this law from more of a patriarchal time or even a pre-modern time, they might be saying, well, of course the mother's impure twice as long because girls aren't worth as much or something like that. But that's not what you find. Instead, you find things like this. So here's someone from the 19th century, early 19th century. I mean, remember, women didn't even have the right to vote. So you want to talk about a commentator coming from a patriarchal context. This is a man named Kyle, and he gives this non-medical explanation. He says, maybe in some way the circumcision of the boy contributed to his cleansing. So that's why he got clean sooner, or the period of time was shorter for the mother. Another commentator, let me give two examples of medical reasons. So some ancient commentators said, well, women bled longer after the birth of a girl. That was medically, that's not proven in any way, but that's what they're supposing. Or another one said that this guy is from the 2nd century, right? So the New Testament times. You want pre-modern, right? Patriarchal times. And his answer was, well, the formation of boys in the womb was shorter. That's not the right answer. But my point is, just be aware that one of the reasons that we might look at this as a sexist law is because we're coming with presuppositions that weren't part of the text. It's amazing to me that you have pre-moderns from much more patriarchal times who aren't reading the law that way at all. And that just causes me to be more humble in approaching the text. I actually think we don't know the reason why the mother is impure twice as long in one context versus the other. And that's okay. Often, Leviticus isn't telling you the why behind the law, it's just explaining the law. So when we come across these difficult things, I would just say, just bear in mind your own presuppositions and try to give the context the benefit of the doubt.
Jay, would you say that context is king?
I have heard that before. The person I hear it from the most is not very reputable, but I think on that one thing, he might be onto something.
Just so all of you know, Jay starts out all of his classes by reminding us that context is king. So it's burned into all of our brains and has been very helpful, and continues to be.
I would say as well, when I wrote a commentary on Leviticus, and when I got to the section, Jenilyn, you also mentioned menstruation.
Mm-hmm.
I made sure to reach out to several different women. I think you're one of them, actually,
Yeah.
Jenilyn,
Mm-hmm.
to have them read through that section with me. because I just knew I don't know what this is like. And it was so helpful. Even something as simple as my wife was reading through and there's a time frame issue in the law. And I kept talking about, and so for a period of this many days and a period of that, and Ski's like, Jay, you got to use a different word. You just, it's like, thanks, babe.
Yeah.
Wasn't on the radar. So
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. And I appreciated, being you knowing that you were letting women speak into that and give feedback on that. And I actually was just looking at that again today, and just the reminder. I think one of the things that you pointed out is that there's no prohibition against someone touching a woman who is on her period, and that she was, she wasn't denied the care of the people around her during that time, and that's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, I think because as a modern, we read it, we're not familiar with ritual impurity laws. We think, well, that must mean she's all alone for 7 days, no one can touch her, etc. And actually, it typically wasn't wrong to become ritually impure. So there's nothing that prevents her husband from being able to hold her and comfort her, or her, her family to be there to comfort her during that time. And bear in mind too, in a pre-modern society where there are not pain medications or even feminine hygiene products, this gave the woman a socially acceptable way to withdraw from contexts which could have been challenging to interact with, given the lack of different supplies and medications available at that time.
I mean, even with the supplies and medications available now, some of us would like that option. So there is, I can see how there's a grace in it as well. Jay, I want to flip around our last couple of questions here, but many of us have friends, neighbors who are Jewish. And I think that's something that comes up in conversation a lot at Restoration, is just how, as we look at the Old Testament, how can our understanding of the Old Testament help to build a bridge, help to be something, as we think about the faith and practices of our Jewish neighbors. How can Leviticus help to be a bridge in conversation and relationship there?
Well, I'll give a few thoughts here, but I would love to hear if anyone's had experience with this, because one thing I learned along the way in Old Testament studies is that Old Testament studies, which was my area, and Judaism, modern day Judaism, are two very different fields. And so while I'm very familiar with Old Testament studies, I'm not tremendously familiar with Judaism, not in a researched or scholarly kind of way. A few comments I would make, it's important to be aware that just as in Christianity, you have different traditions and streams, the same is true in Judaism. You can think of, 3 main streams in Judaism. In my mind, they kind of go like this. Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox would be comparable to fundamentalism in Christianity. Then you have traditional Judaism, which I think more like evangelical. And then you have Reform Judaism, which is more like mainline. And they're very, very different approaches to the Bible, to their faith. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It's important to know, just because somebody claims to be Jewish, that might just be a cultural thing for them, not really even a religious thing, and they might keep some of the high holidays, but not really read their Bible very much or pray very often. And so it's important to know which stream they're coming from. And then I think it's also important to know, that as you're interacting with them, there are things like, I'm not sure Old Testament is going to be the most friendly term for them. That it might make, so you want to begin to think about the kind of language you're going to use. You might just talk about the Bible, because that's what they'll refer to the scriptures as, the Bible, or they'll say the Hebrew Bible. But I think Leviticus can help in a couple ways. One is just being familiar with it. Again, if you're dealing with someone who's coming out of the Reformed tradition, they might not ever have read Leviticus, whereas an ultra-Orthodox person probably knows it backwards and forwards, right? So, but you just being aware of it already makes you fairly distinct in terms of the Gentiles that they typically interact with. And showing an interest, try to understand. Hey, I've read Leviticus before. How do you understand what it's teaching, and what are the important things for you out of Leviticus? And just, trying to understand and build a bridge that way is probably the first place that you want to start. But beyond that, I mean, if others on the call have had more experience sharing the gospel with Jews, or have found a book to be particularly helpful, please don't hesitate to let us know.
Anyone want to chime in on that? Who's had some experience? Well, it's something we'll keep talking about. And if anyone does have resources that have been helpful to you on that, feel free to let us know, and we'd be glad to share them.
I can share something.
Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
A couple of decades ago, I had a Jewish friend who was pretty much almost Orthodox, probably more traditional. And she'd written a thesis for an art project. And she was also a teacher that I worked with. And I read her thesis and I read what she'd written, and then she was talking about, she was making some kind of connection, and she was going to be unfaithful to her husband. And it was kind of part of what she was thinking in this draft, what she was writing. And I said to her, you work so hard to eat the right food, to prepare things a certain way, and then you might do this against your family and your husband and probably leave your marriage. That doesn't seem like it fits. And I wrote her this note, and like, this never happens to me. Anytime I stick my neck out, I blunder and make mistakes. And she wrote me back and she said, wow, you made me really reconsider what I was doing because of what you said. And I didn't know about I hadn't thought about ritual purity versus moral purity. I mean, it just all had come in to play in her document.
That's wonderful.
And, it was amazing.
That's wonderful. Yeah, many of you on the call, I'm sure, are aware of this, but also be aware that in modern Judaism today, many, do I want to say many? I'll put it this way. Not every law that is followed today is one that you can actually find coming out of Leviticus or the Old Testament. There has been a growth of oral tradition over the years that, again, is not Bible-based per se, that has formed at least some of the laws that are followed today. So be careful not to think, oh, if a modern Jew is doing it, they're following biblical law here. They may just be following tradition that's been handed down to them through the centuries.
That's helpful. So there's obviously a lot more we could talk about on that note, but as we're coming to the end of our time, Jay, I'd just love for you to share a little bit about how Leviticus points us to Jesus, and how you've seen Jesus and grown to love him more through your studies in Leviticus.
When we were in the UK, we're going to this church where they put the songs up on the screen. And after about a year of studying Leviticus, so my 9 to 5 was studying Leviticus. By the way, if you ever want to get out of a conversation at a dinner party, if you just mention to people that you've been studying, anyway, so I'd be there and a song would come on the screen that would just mention sacrifice, or it would mention atonement. And usually I couldn't help but start to cry, because studying Leviticus had just made so much more sweet to me what God had done for us in Christ, this ultimate sacrifice on our behalf. You know, one of my favorite verses in Leviticus is in chapter 17, verse 11. And it's one that I say every single time I take communion. And in the Hebrew it goes, Ki nefesh habasar b'damhu, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. And then it goes, Vani netativ lachem. And it's usually translated here, and I have given it to you on the altar. But in the Hebrew, there's an extra I included. It's I myself have given the lifeblood of that animal on the altar to you to atone for your lives. And one commentator puts it this way: what the verse is doing here, Leviticus 17:11, it's reversing how we normally think about sacrifice. We normally think about sacrifice as something we give to God. And there's a sense in which that's very true. I mean, Israelites brought the animal, but what this verse is saying is, do you know why this even works? Because I, in my love and grace for you, am allowing this to be a way for you to make things right with me, or for things to be made right with me. And as a Christian, you're reading that, I can't help but think of Romans 5:8. God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's that reversing again of the conceptual direction. It's not something we've given to God. God's the one who's provided the sacrifice on our behalf. And so Leviticus for me has, when we start singing Before the Throne of God Above, that talks about Christ as the high priest, it just comes alive so much more deeply and richly and sweetly when you see all that Jesus is fulfilling from the book of Leviticus.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought. And I think that's a great, that's also a really helpful encouragement to kind of look for the concepts of Leviticus in the songs that we're singing too. Because I think that's a way that it can connect. Those songs and hymns that we sing in worship are often a way that this theology becomes real for us, and that these things that we read in the page become real and are ingrained in us in a way that we may not often think about when these songs are familiar, but to really pay attention for that. So thank you for that. I'm excited for that. We're going to be digging into Leviticus, and I'm eager to be reading it again. If you all would, before we close, would love for you all to just share either in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and share just a sentence or two that you are taken away from tonight, something that you heard that you want to remember, especially as we start looking at Leviticus and reading it. So feel free to toss that in the chat, or as I said, unmute yourself and just say a sentence or two about what you heard tonight. And as we do that, Joseph, can you stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to catch up with you? No, you got to go.
Oh, I can stay.
Okay. We'll do a little after party.
I'll remember. My takeaway today is to ask myself, what is the value of the law that I'm reading?
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to do that this time as I read through Leviticus.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw some head nods on that one.
That's great. It's not always easy, Jenny, but aim for it. Go for it.
Mm-hmm.
I concur with Jenny. I thought that was great. And also, I always think of Leviticus, it seems very harsh. But now thinking of one of the things you said at the very beginning is that it actually provides a path for the Israelites to have a relationship with God. So it's actually very kind and loving, and it's extending an olive branch. So I thought that was a really nice way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Susanna says she's eager to grow in her appreciation of what Christ has done for her through reading Leviticus. That's good. Any other takeaways?
Just the 2 points that Jay mentioned about how to think about laws that are unfair.
Mm-hmm.
Be aware of your modern presuppositions, and context is king.
Mm-hmm. Well done, Doug. Well, Jay, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I will tell all of you this commentary that Jay wrote is super helpful, super accessible. So if you are wanting a good companion as you're looking through Leviticus, this commentary is great. Jay, I realized when I was taking Pentateuch, you were on the verge of publishing this. It was in the syllabus that it was coming soon, and we were praying for its completion. So
yeah. It's I have on good authority that's healed at least 7 people of insomnia. They just get in and non-habit forming, added bonus.
Well, we're so thankful for your work, and thankful to all of you for being here with us tonight. Let me just close us in prayer. Actually, Jay, would you mind praying for us to close our time?
I'd be happy to. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It is incredible to think not only of you leaving the glories of heaven for the dusts of Palestine, a throne for a manger, but that you would give yourself for us and die the cruelest of deaths, the most shameful of deaths, that we might live and that we might be free. We praise you as the risen Lord. We follow you as our victorious King, the Lion of David, the slain Lamb, the Good Shepherd. Lord, all of these things are high priest on our behalf. And I pray for my brothers and sisters on this call that you would strengthen them in their faith, following you, and in their love for you. And I ask this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Jay. If anyone who wants to stick around for a few minutes, we'll get a little life update from Joseph T. in Singapore. But the rest of you are free to go and enjoy your cold, snowy evening. Thank you, Jay.
I might stick
you
around.
You are welcome to stay and hear the life update.
Just to hear a bit on Mr. T here.
Absolutely. Joseph, how's it going?
Hi. Yeah, I think Chris is coming out soon because I think the baby is due for a feed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that mean
so
we get her?
I could call her now, but yeah. So since I'm talking from the